Where should I start?
I think you should start right from Egypt on.
Oh my God. Okay.
Yeah.
But yes.
Yeah.
Well, I was born in Cairo, Egypt, and I did my studies there, including my undergraduate studies at a university called the American University in Cairo, in which I'm very proud of having been the trustee of that university for the last 10, 15 years. I don't know what to tell you. Both my parents were teachers, university professors. My mother is English, my father is Egyptian, and they met when they were both graduate students at Oxford. My mother was math, my father did English literature, and when they decided to get married, her family were very upset, as you can imagine, or maybe you can't imagine, back in the 1950s, for all sorts of reasons. And my father's family didn't really care. They were a little bit more liberal, agnostic, let's put it this way. And anyway, so I'm the result of that union, which is a very happy one, and enjoyed having two very nice and interesting parents, I have to say.
Mm-hmm. And so they were academics, and that was obviously a very sort of important part of your growing up. Did you ever feel the siren song of the academic world versus the financial world, or?
No, I knew nothing about finance. In fact, I did a master's in economics, and then I worked at the World Bank for a couple of years as an economist, and at the time, I was going to go back to London where I did my master's, and I knew Larry Summers well because he was the chief economist at the World Bank then, and I had an offer to go back to go and go to Oxford, and then to do my PhD in the US. And I asked him, "What do you think?" And he said, "Listen, do you want the short answer or the long one?" Because Larry tends to be very cut to the chase. I said, "Well, I want both." He said, "Okay, fine. The short one, stay here in the US. The long one, why do you want to go to Oxford?" And I don't know if anyone has gone to Oxford, so no disparagement there. I said, "Well, I can see myself drinking a lot of sherry and writing a thesis over 8 years." He said, yes, that's what I suspected. No, stay in the US. So I did my graduate studies in economics, in econometrics, in fact, in the US.
Mm-hmm. And what was your experience in the U.S. when you first moved? What were your perspectives and sort of your thoughts on the country? Was it a place that you recognized that you wanted to put down roots right away, or what was that experience like?
No, all of this was purely ad hoc. It's, I do believe at the end of the day, one's life is to some extent a random walk, and so there is some path dependence, but essentially we're in one form or another in the war. You can turn left, you can turn right, anything can happen. I was at the World Bank for a couple of years, and I had intended to go back and do my graduate studies. Instead, I stayed in the US by, serendipitous. Mm-hmm. And so I wasn't literally thinking of that. But in hindsight, one of the reasons why I stayed is because the US is, without a doubt, with the exception of Canada, without a doubt, an absolutely extraordinary country. Mm-hmm. When one says it's the land of opportunities, it's truly, truly the land of opportunities.
Mm-hmm. And so you did go to work on Wall Street.
Yes.
At that point, and you, from talking to you and reading about you, it sounds like it was a satisfying sort of role and experience. But ultimately, you sort of migrated away from what you were doing in structured finance, became interested in infrastructure. Is that sort of?
Yes, that's partly correct. Me joining Wall Street was again purely coincidental. When I finished my PhD, I had an offer to go teach, and so this was before the GPS days, and so I went. I did what you call you present your paper, and then they made me an offer to teach there, and then I was newly married. I took my wife. We got lost. And instead of taking us 2 hours driving from Boston to New Haven, It took us a little bit longer, and we got lost in the wrong neighborhoods, let's put it this way. And so by the time we arrived, my wife said, okay, I am going to be staying in New York and you can stay in New Haven. And so I said, okay, maybe that's not a good idea since we just got married. And so I had a very good friend who's now at PIMCO. In fact, the gentleman who's speaking in the other session is a vice chairman of PIMCO, and I know him very well, John. And he said, why don't you come to Lehman Brothers? And I said, okay, but what do you want me to do? Research. And I told him, should I be doing research? He said, no, of course not. Why would you come to Lehman and do research? You might as well stay at Yale and do research. I said, okay, but what am I supposed to do? He said, sales. And so I said, but I've never sold anything. He said, okay, perfect. That's how you're going to learn. And so I spent a couple of years, I'm exaggerating. I did sales of structured derivative products, which I thought I understood. Yes. Anyway, so that's what I did. And then I moved to Morgan Stanley, and I was already doing infrastructure project financing at Lehman, and Morgan Stanley was a much larger platform, and I did that for about 10, 15 years, and then switched to private equity, and I started the first infrastructure fund there.
Yeah. So tell us about the formation of I Squared and how that sort of came to be, and really when you started the firm, what was your vision for what the firm would be? It's obviously sort of grown and changed significantly, but when you started the firm and made that decision to launch on your own, what was your vision?
You know, I'll be honest, I don't think there was a particular grand vision. I think the objective was very simple. Post 2008 and Volcker rule, I felt that the best thing to serve our investors was to be independent. That was really the main driver. And being independent allows you to have a much better alignment of interest, not that captive funds don't, but that's at least was my feeling. And by doing that, you can dedicate 100% of your effort and time to our investors. And so that was the genesis behind that. The second thing is, being independent gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of the way you go about managing your investments and your assets. You could bring in a lot of people who have operational know-how. If you're in an investment bank or a financial institution, there's always some cultural clash, right? Meaning it's difficult to get people from industry to come and join. At least that was then. I don't think that's still the case. But that, I think, was really behind what we want to do. It's operational focus, 100% focus on our investors and the kinds of investments we do.
So maybe for everyone's benefit, I think, everyone has perceptions of what infrastructure investing is, what it entails, whether it's bridges, toll roads, et cetera. But I think maybe you can give a little perspective in terms of how you view the space, what you've built sort of I Squared on. And I think it'd be beneficial just to hear a little bit more about sort of how the company's structured, but then specifically sort of some of the specialties and areas that you are involved in.
Look, it's a great question because infrastructure has generally different meanings to different people. The most commonly understood one is that you would invest in infrastructure because it gives you stable cash flows. It's part of a core portfolio. It's linked to inflation. It will give you, maybe 8, 9, 10% returns, something around that. That's true, but that's true of a simplistic view. The fact is, if you take, for example, a power plant produces electricity. That power plant you can look at it and have radically different risk profiles. The first is that the power plant has a long-term contract with Hydro-Quebec. And in fact, it's a tolling agreement. So basically, you take no commodity risk. Let's say it's a gas plant, and you take no risk on the price of electricity. All you do is operational risk, which managing the plant. effectively that risk is Hydro-Quebec plus, call it 50, 70 basis points to account for operational risk. The second is a power plant where you have a 10-year PPA with Hydro-Quebec. Then you're taking operational risk and you take potentially spark spread risk, so the differential between the price of electricity and gas. You have to bring in that gas and buy for it. And so suddenly there's a little bit more complexity, there's a little bit more commodity risk. And then what happens 10 years hence when that PPA expires? So you have to take a view on the power market. So that can't be Hydro-Quebec risk, which is essentially AAA plus 70 basis points, has to take something else in it to account for all of these risks. And then the third one is no contract at all. I built a power plant and I'm selling what you would call merchant on the grid. So day ahead, I have the grid authority calling me, whether it's PJM or whatever, and they say, okay, you can basically put in your electricity to a particular bus point and the price is X. Maybe the price is $150 or maybe it's $2 because I've sold it peak season, in winter, in the summer, or at night when there is no demand, for example. So that again becomes a very different risk. So the same asset with very different risk characteristics can exist. And so people think of a power plant with a contract as being the same, but in fact, when you dig deep, you find out that the fundamental risk profiles can vary a lot. And so you can apply that same idea to power generation, to transport. You can have a toll road, which has an annuity where the government says, all I want from you is please maintain it and make it available to people. Whether there's one car or 100 cars, that is not your risk, don't worry about it. That effectively is government risk, right? So you'll be making, let's say it's the US government that gives you that contract, you're making treasuries, call it 30-year treasuries, plus 75 bips spread. Very different than if you take traffic risk, maintenance risk, diversion risk, and so on and so forth. And so I Squared Capital tends to invest in, of the three, I'd say between 2 and 3. So where there is a minimum guaranteed return, and by guaranteed I mean a small g, and then an upside. So we would invest in toll roads, for example, where we really believe that the underlying traffic is there. So I'll give you a simple example. What do you think is the growth of cars, of traffic in the US or in Europe or North America? On average, on roads, what would you say?
3%.
How much?
3%.
3%.
I was going to say 10.
10. It's generally between 0 and -1. So Europe has not seen any traffic growth, or the US, on its road. Don't confuse congestion in Toronto, right, with traffic growth. Very different. There has been no traffic growth for decades, for all sorts of reasons. What is the traffic growth on a road in India?
15%.
Correct. So what is the implied price elasticity, price or toll elasticity if you want, for a road in Europe or in the US? Okay. High, elastic or inelastic?
Inelastic.
Highly elastic. A 10% increase in tolls will lead to a drop in volume by much more than 10%. What is it in India? Highly inelastic. So a 10% increase in roads will lead to a more than 10% increase in volume. Why? Because one is a basic need, the other one has become less of a basic need. What would take you, excluding Toronto traffic, an hour to go from A to B, given the conditions of roads in India, it would take you 3 or 4 hours. So it's a 3 or 4x multiple in terms of time. So with the last decades of having a middle class that has grown not 5 million, 10 million, or 20 million, So people who've moved out of poverty into Indian middle class, you're talking of 400 million people. The demand for fundamental produce and the consumption pattern of household has changed. White goods, on time, fresh goods, and so on and so forth. So there is a huge demand. The cost of paying a little bit more in tolls is nothing relative to the demand and the cost of transportation and the ultimate end product. So that, I think, is what we're trying to do. We will never invest in a road unless the price is right in the US or in Europe, but we would definitely look to invest in roads in, say, in toll roads in India, other things being equal, precisely because the fundamentals are there for the coming decades.
And so you are a truly global firm. I think you have 6 offices globally, but you're investing globally. Where are you seeing the most opportunities, and what regions do you think, when you look at sort of how you invest, the processes you put in place, the sourcing, the relationships, where are you sort of most excited from an infrastructure standpoint, or is that too broad a question to?
No, I'm sorry. The question is today or in general?
I think,
under the current environment, or because under the current environment, I think your opportunities are everywhere, in my view. But I think one will have to be extremely careful over the coming 12 to 18 months for the reasons I'm sure we can talk about. But in general, high growth economies like India, Brazil are always very attractive. There's a genuine need to upgrade the infrastructure. But the largest and most efficient market is, without a doubt, the US.
And when the firm was started, what was your geographic focus when you first started? Has that evolved? It was
I've always maintained a global perspective, because in infrastructure, the probability of default is extremely low, right? On the other hand, the loss severity could be extremely high. Only because, if you multiply A by B, your probability of loss is not as low as what people may think. And the reason is because you tend to be exposed to quite a bit of idiosyncratic shocks. By that I mean, if I'm the only one who owns the bridge connecting, I have no idea, A to B in the town, say Manhattan, if I own the Brooklyn Bridge, right, and I'm the only one who's been given a concession of the Brooklyn Bridge, if tomorrow New York State were to say, I've changed my mind, you know what, concession has changed, you thought that you can charge tariff of X, I changed it. I have no leeway. Yes, I mean, it's a bad example because you have US arbitration, but it can take 20 years, and in the meantime, you're ruined. On the other hand, if there's hundreds of bridges, then there is strength in numbers, right? Because infrastructure is lumpy in that sense, there's not 50 bridges that you can monetize in a particular city. So you have to be very careful of government intervention in what ultimately is a form of public good, right? No matter what you say. And so that's where the nuance is. So US ultimately provides the best environment. And for me, having a global platform allowed us for having that diversity across regions and across sectors. And so we can constantly arbitrage across these different markets. And that's because we have people on the ground that understand the local issues extremely well.
And from sort of the management of the potential sort of political risk, how do you as a firm sort of approach that? And have you had over the years like any sort of notable situations that were that escalated that risk, that you had lessons learned or were able to sort of figure that out and mitigate the situation?
Yes, the biggest political risk we saw, having told you what I saw, was in the US. Because the concept of public-private partnerships writ large is not as prevalent as you have in Canada or in Europe. So that doesn't mean that you don't have tough situations in high growth economies, but we will never invest in those. So we have a very strict perspective in terms of and criteria on how one would invest in these regions. So we tend to look for dollarized economies. We tend to look to sectors and markets where there is a deep penetration of other players. We tend to bring in international institutions like the World Bank, the IFC, US Development, the OPIC, which is now called DFC, Development Financial Corporations, as an investor that provides a kind of political coverage. The reason I say that the political risk is a little bit more heightened in the US, precisely because states and municipalities do not have the same experience in dealing with the private sector, pension funds or otherwise, or private equity funds in the management of infrastructure assets. Mm-hmm. So if you take a step back and you look at Canada, Canada has had privatizations of airports, of roads, and so on and so forth. Let me ask you this question. How many airports on a percentage basis are privatized in the United States?
0.
Correct.
Yeah.
Close to 0. 0.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I was mentioning that example of lunch also.
Yeah. I think actually Nicole Musico, I'm not sure if you saw her session, but she was involved when I think Ontario Teachers was one of the first groups to I think they bought the London City airports. That was one of the first transactions like that globally, right?
Well, in England, in the UK, almost all of the airports are privatized. Okay, let's take another sector. How many water municipalities do we have in the US?
Hundreds.
Hundreds. 500? Anyone else?
I would say thousands.
Thousands. 55,000. Oh.
Wow.
Private market represents, I think, less than 10%. Again, a comparison to the UK, only because it's an easy one and we can recognize and we can relate to it. 100% of the water sector was privatized back in the late 70s, early 80s. Mm-hmm. Broadly speaking, it's been very successful. Criticism, people have said no, we should renationalize. Both Conservative and Labour governments will almost certainly renationalize the rail system. And by renationalize, I mean they will let the concessions run its course and not renew them. But that's fine. That is in the purview of the government to do that. And that was a failure for all sorts of reasons, because at the end of the day, it required so much subsidies to run them that in fact the privatization didn't achieve what it was supposed to do, unlike the water sector, which is different. So 55,000 municipalities, even if people wanted to try and look at privatizing them, the challenge is going to be that Ontario Teachers would have a challenge to go to small municipalities where there's 5,000 households, 2,000 households, and try to aggregate that. So unless there is a omnibus way of doing it, it will be very difficult to involve. And so when it does involve, people don't have the precedents and the examples. That's why sometimes the political risk, it's counterintuitive, but that political risk in the US is more than one thing.
Yeah, it makes sense. And so you have been appointed to President Biden's National Infrastructure Advisory Council. Can you tell us a little bit more about that body, your role, the rationale, and then what you see the implications are there, and maybe even getting a lens of thinking if there is a change in the coming election and then the presidential election, what that could mean as well.
The President's National Infrastructure Council was really created in the aftermath of 9/11 to deal with fundamentally security issues associated with risk to our critical infrastructure. So power plants, hydro dams, airports, basically critical infrastructure that could be the target for terrorist attacks. And I'm not divulging any confidential information, but that continues to be still the case. And I can tell you, more so than 2 years ago. So there are both actors, either state-sponsored or non-state sponsored, that are looking to create havoc by effectively trying to paralyze, if you want, our infrastructure. So there are two ways you can do it when it comes to cybersecurity, let's say. One is IT, so basically ransomware, the guy comes in and freezes your computer. That, I think we all face that every day, and that is on the rise. And the other one, which is more pernicious and dangerous, of course, is operational technology breaches. So you have, let's say, a Siemens turbine. What they would do is effectively steal the material on the IT aspect of how the Siemens turbine works. The Siemens turbines, of course, today is linked to the internet, to the web, and so on. And so they will try and penetrate the physical equipment and take control of it. And that is a little bit more complicated, but also much more dangerous in doing that. So that was the origin of the National Infrastructure Council. It's evolved into effectively looking at the resiliency of infrastructure in terms of general risks, not just terrorist risks or cyber attacks, but resiliency, climate change, and various other issues. And that is one of the things that we're focusing on, which is the impact the climate is going to have on the resiliency of the infrastructure in the United States.
Okay. And you thinking about sort of the UN says that climate change is the number one threat to humanity right now. The role that infrastructure can play in augmenting that threat. Where do you see the biggest opportunities, and how do you see infrastructure evolving, over the coming years as we face more and more of a challenge from climate change?
I'd say there are several challenges. The first is I've alluded to, which is funding. If you take the US again as an example, the demands for upgrading the infrastructure, just to upgrade it to the current level, is roughly about, call it $3 trillion in the coming years. What the president has achieved is honestly extraordinary, because everyone has tried to do that over the last 30, 40 years and literally failed. Mm-hmm. So there is the infrastructure bill, IIJA of $1.2 trillion. There is the CHIPS Act, which has an infrastructure component related to digital infrastructure, which is about, I forget now, $400 and some billion. And then there's the IRA, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, which is essentially 391 billion towards greening both infrastructure, manufacturing, and other things. So you have these three elements. So the first one, I said, is funding. And so that sounds strange given that you have all that money over the coming 7 years. The problem is that money is precisely over the coming 7 years, and a lot of it is going to go into upgrading things that should have been upgraded in the last 30 years. So as a quick comparison, US spends less than 2% of its GDP in infrastructure investment since the 1970s. In contrast, even take into account the fact that China started from a much lower base, almost nothing, it has been spending in the last 40 years over 8% of its GDP in infrastructure. So that today, fiber penetration in China is almost the same as in the US. Train rides is quadruple what we have in the US, and so on and so forth. So the first one is funding, because in 7 years, all that money is not going to be available anymore. And then what? There is no infrastructure bill that will, in my view, ever pass. I shouldn't say ever, but almost certainly is not going to pass any Congress for the coming 20, 30 years.
No.
So therefore, you have to be able to somehow galvanize and bring in private capital. And by private, I just don't mean private equity. I mean pension funds, private operators, and so on, into investing and find sustainable long-term ways of funding the infrastructure. So I'd say that's challenge one. The second one is most of the investment that is going to occur, both in the US and globally, is to maintain conventional infrastructure. But that's not possible anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have to be able to adopt and adapt technology to infrastructure, whether it's airports, through IoT, whether it's roads, through artificial intelligence, AI, that gives you a better sense of if weather changes, what kind of accident is going to happen, and how, and so on. So all that ecosystem is being appended as we speak. But that investment in technology has not been taken into account by anyone. And then the third is that we are not incorporating a holistic view of how to deal with that basic infrastructure. Example, when it comes to climate change. So we're pushing for EVs, electric vehicles. Sorry, but electric vehicles that are going to run on what? On roads. Roads are made of what? Bitumen, which is oil product, right? Or we're going to renew bridges. Sorry, with what? With steel. 80% plus of steel production uses coal. So, okay, we want wind. If you want to build all of your wind plants to satisfy the Paris targets, you have to use steel enough to build, I can't remember, 20,000 golden bridges. So I'm saying is, another one. Given the movement, the global, not just less so, of course, in industrial economies, when I'm talking about high growth economies, emerging markets, given the continuous move from rural to urban areas, globally, the world is going to have to build one New York City equivalent every month for the coming 40 years.
Wow.
So I'm trying to say is, unless we change fundamentally the inputs into infrastructure that support all we want to do on the green side, I think we're basically saving here and spending there.
Of course.
And that requires you to invest massively in technology and fundamentally change the way we're using our inputs and our outputs. But that's coming at a cost. So unfortunately, the reality is if we want to do that, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, I'm saying we want to do that, effectively it's a global tax that we have to pay. And so where we're not being honest is that, yes, the cost of production of wind and solar has come down dramatically, but for us to maintain that, the world will have to agree to pay itself, right? Or to impose on itself a tax, which means potentially lower economic growth and so on. On the other hand, it will mean longer term higher productivity, which will also mean higher growth and so on. But there's no free lunch, basically.
So from a technology perspective, from your view, is there the combination of talent and capital flowing into the funding of new companies, technologies, commercialization of academic research in order to achieve some of those objectives? And where are we at on that?
One of the objectives of the CHIPS Act is in fact in the US to do that. And the answer is there's a huge amount of money that's being spent on R&D, on technology. Interestingly, and in fairness, steel companies realize that they can't continue to use coal, so they're looking for all sorts of other ways of doing it. But the point is, the reason why infrastructure in general has been slow in adopting technology is for the same reason I gave you that first example. If I have a power plant and I have a 30-year contract with Hydro-Quebec, what is my incentive of any innovation? Zero. Because Hydro-Quebec gave me that toll agreement X number of years ago and told me, your plant will work on a heat rate, so basically the efficiency of the plant, if you want, of X. More efficient, I'm not interested, because I'm giving you a 30-year contract, so deliver X. So the moment you have that, the plant operator is not particularly incentivized to innovate. So generally, if you have a regulated framework, that regulated framework says it's geared towards, please ensure that my road is safe. It doesn't say, please use artificial intelligence and diagnostics to be able to tell me what are the probability of an accident occurring at tell area. That doesn't exist. But precisely because you have an inherently regulated system that wants certainty of service as opposed to necessary innovation. So paradoxically, that sector is the least inclined to adopt technology. And that's what you need to break. So it's not a question of capital, it's a question of proper incentives to be able to fundamentally change the way the industry is operating.
Yeah. I know you have established an infrastructure technology fund.
Yes, I do want to mention that.
Well, but how would you describe the mandate of that fund?
Well, I have my colleague and partner here who runs that fund in the room. The idea is a simple one. We're trying to identify technologies that have a direct application to infrastructure. So we manage $40 billion. So think of it on an enterprise value. It's about, call it globally, 80 billion, something like that. So we've invested in just about everything. And so we have a very good sense of what technologies would make sense or not. Now, in the grand scheme of things, we're very small, right? We may own, 40 toll roads in India. I think it's a little bit more, but okay, there are thousands of toll roads. So in that sense, we really, it's a very insignificant part of it. But the point is, we have a good understanding of what it entails in running a road and operating it. So when you have technologies that deals with road management, or with energy efficiency in buildings, or with actually cybersecurity, then we have a good understanding and we can test these technologies on our own portfolio companies to see what they work on. So that confluence of both is extremely exciting.
What are there any particular technologies or innovations that you're particularly excited about?
I can think of two. One, only because with my work on the US President's Council, I'm much more aware and acutely focused on these things, is OT. So we've invested in an Israeli-US company that has focused on operational technology risk, and they've done phenomenal work. We've invested in another company that is looking to neutralize. So this is not a defense company, it doesn't shoot down drones, but neutralize drones for critical infrastructure. Another one is grid, vehicle to grid. So we're going to see a lot more electric vehicles at home. It's one thing to plug your electric car so that you can charge it at home. It becomes more complicated to use the battery to then sell into the grid and to optimize, given your particular area, when is the best time to sell into the grid and when is the best time to consume electricity. That technology is complex, mostly because you don't want to impact the single most important item in an EV, which is the battery. And so battery manufacturers and car manufacturers give you a 10-year warranty. The last thing they want is someone to play around with the battery and impact its expected life. So that technology it's not that it's innovative, but it's complex to do, and we've invested in companies that does exactly that. So tomorrow, if we have an entire fleet of school buses, which after 4 o'clock does absolutely nothing, between 4 and 7 o'clock in the morning, if it becomes electrified, then it can charge and it can become effectively a store of electricity and optimize and sell into the grid. So you suddenly have a truly distributed electric system that you can have in cities and globally.
What advice would you have for families that are either have contemplated investing in infrastructure, but also we think about sort of emerging opportunities in infra tech. What advice would you have? And also sort of from your experience, like what role have you seen the evolution of families, family offices being that source of capital, maybe predominantly on this sort of like earlier stage investment side, but what advice would you have? And then what do you see as the role of very wealthy families playing in a lot of the areas that you do?
What I found fascinating is that family offices are willing to listen and show flexibility and innovation, which is different from a large pension fund that have a fiduciary. Not that the family office doesn't have a fiduciary, but I'm saying to be able to invest in a diversified way and meet pensions long-term obligations, and that is the single biggest engine, in my view, of creativity, and it's underappreciated. Mm-hmm. So family offices have been at the forefront of making these investments. Our infotech fund, we have over 300 institutional investors, US pension funds, Canadian pension funds, almost all of the UK pension fund system, European, so on. We do have very large family offices, but in our tech fund, it's almost exclusively, it's interesting, either family offices or pension funds that invested massively directly in infrastructure and are thinking, oops, what is going to happen to infrastructure 20 years from now? So I better understand it.
Almost a bit of it, yes. Yeah.
So I think the innovation, the creativity that you have through family offices, in my view, is extraordinary. Mm-hmm.
From a personal perspective, you've obviously been, very successful. You built a great company. How do you, from a personal perspective, think about your opportunity with your own sort of personal your own personal capital to invest in things that you can have a positive impact in the world, and how do you view that and separate that maybe from your sort of day job?
It's interesting. I'll answer two ways. The first is one thing that I hear every time someone joins iSquared Capital is they say, I'm so excited to work on something like infrastructure because it's tangible and concrete. I understand what an airport is. I understand what it does. When we have clean water, I know what it does, and so on and so forth. And you asked me a question, what made me think about infrastructure? I'll tell you, if I may, a personal story. So I worked at the World Bank for a couple of years. And I was responsible for what at the time, so this is early 90s, we were called structural adjustment programs, anyone who followed these things. So SAPs were basically the instrument that the World Bank and the IMF used to encourage, I wouldn't say force, emerging economies to fundamentally change macroeconomic policy, devaluations, privatizations, and so on and so forth, fiscal reforms, and as a condition for doing that, we'll give you the money. Then they realized there was a slight problem because that caused massive poverty and, of course, massive riots, and no one liked the World Bank nor the IMF. And it didn't seem to work very well because they were not able to sustain these reforms because there was not enough support. So they created a group called Social Dimensions of Adjustment, which I was a member of that. And the idea was to understand what are the social implications of structural adjustment. I remember the first meeting in 1990 I had at the World Bank, at the IMF, which lasted a grand total of about 12 minutes. So we arrived, first of all, there's still a big rivalry between the IMF and the World Bank. IMF thinks of itself as much more important, which in fact, in fairness, they are, than the World Bank. And so they had little patience for World Bank economists. So we come into the meeting and IMF says, yep, how can we help you? And we said, well, we're thinking about structural adjustments, social aspects of structural adjustments. So there's consternation, and they say social, we don't know what that means. I said, well, either income equality issues or poverty levels. The guy said, stop. This is the end of the conversation. Please leave the room. We have nothing to do with that. We refuse to talk to you. Today, one of the key elements of what the IMF does is, of course, poverty reduction. So it took a good 30 years to be able to get to where we are today. And in my trips to Africa, because I was working a lot on Western Africa and Eastern Africa, we were looking to building schools. So the whole infrastructure around schools, the electricity and so on, because that was the point, we do it. And in driving on a road, which is a mud road, we were in a nice Jeep or something like that, I saw a group of what must have been 10-year-old girls, impeccably dressed, beautiful. And so I said, so where are they going? It's not Sunday, there's no church, it's nothing. And they said, to school. I said, where is the school? He said, about an hour walking from the village. So every day, they would walk for an hour back and forth. 10-year-old. I said, is this a joke? He said, no. I said, why? I said, because there's no public transportation. And the cars that they have, obviously, on these roads is just not enough. I said, well, what happens in the rainy season? Because you're a tropical area. He said, they don't go to school. It's not possible. And that for me is, I still have that image of Ivory Coast, the background, and these girls walking one after the other like that. As I said, they were 100% dedicated. They were focused on what they wanted to do. And there was no roads and no schools. Or there was a school, but an hour and a half. And we were investing and looking at some fancy project, which at the end, I don't know if it ever happened or not. Because I left. And so that for me was my message of, you know what? If you invest in infrastructure, it helps reduce poverty. It helps make a huge difference to people. So that's in a way the mission that we all have at I Squared, and it's extraordinary. Everyone tells me the same thing. I won't talk about my own personal stuff, but I think it's important that at least in whatever it is that you do in your day-to-day life, that you have some perspective on how you're helping people. Besides your own philanthropic work, because that is ultimately what you can do on your own. But I think you need to be able to combine that work with a minimum amount of ethics and some principle guidance. And in a way, that's what you're doing. Your organization is effectively doing that. That conference is, for me, a perfect example of what this is about.
No. It's very powerful. Thank you. Just looking at time, does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask Sadek?
Sadek, I've known you from day one when you launched the fund. Your co-founders, my joint, but I want to talk about where everyone about diversity, and everyone talks about diversity. I remember the New York office in Oakland Park 10 years ago, and what diversity you created in African countries in so many countries.
Look, so I think it's a good thing to have it explicitly and maybe have explicit goals. And in certain sectors, I think it's extremely important. I think for me, the diversity is at the end of the day in the way you look and think about things. I don't think it'd be dictated from the outside. So, okay, I don't know. I never tend to think about these things, but we're very well represented ethnically, we're very well represented in terms of gender, although finance is one where it's extremely hard to have gender representation, and that's very unfortunate. My old boss at Morgan Stanley was an absolutely formidable person called Zoe Cruz. And Zoe Cruz was asked this question when she became the first woman president of a bank. She said, would you prioritize jobs for women? And she said, no, I will always seek the best, but if I have a man and a woman at equal capabilities, I will always choose a woman. And I totally understand and ascribe to that view. What we've done in our portfolio companies, for example, is encourage in a very bottom-up way, as opposed to say, you need to have X number percentage. So we say, we'd like you to have that, but you will have to come up with your own goals. And we've been doing that very successfully. So I'd say less than half of our employees are women. That number vacillates, unfortunately, because as a private equity, we buy and sell assets. So sometimes when we buy new, it's a new concept. But we've done something else. We've had close to $4 billion of financings, which include in many of them, not all of them, gender diversity targets. That, to be fair, didn't come from us. So we gave the tools to the portfolio companies and said, you tell us what you want to do, and it was a bottom-up approach. And that's exactly what you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
What is the investment demand like in the United States for solar?
I try to understand, in terms of the dispatch curve, meaning in terms of households?
Whether there's a lot of investment dollars
Yes.
wanting to invest in U.S. solar.
Yes. Post the Inflation Reduction Act, absolutely. Because what you're going to have is mandates from above, and the fact that in almost all cases, solar has reached essentially grid parity, if not cheaper. So wind, solar, there's a huge demand for it, and there will continue to be a big demand. There's one slight problem, which of course Canada is aware of, and very upset with the US, is trade barriers. One thing that the US has done is they've basically stopped the importation of Chinese solar panels. There's a slight problem. China produces 80-90% of the solar panels. So on the one hand, you have a clear push towards solar electricity, which makes sense because, as I said, it's become much more efficient, and the mass production has allowed to bring down the costs significantly. On the other hand, you have geopolitical issues that will make it difficult for you to import. And then on top of it, you have made in America component that makes the problem even more complicated.
And is solar, when it trades, is it priced at a premium, or is it on a yield basis comparable to other forms of energy when it trades?
Right. The thing with solar is that it's very difficult to build a solar plant and not have a contract with it. On the other hand, you could potentially build what you would call a peaker, right? Because it sells electricity at peak markets, and you make your projection that you'll make enough money to cover that, and not necessarily have a contract that goes with it. The solar, because of its intermittency, you need to be able to have a long-term PPA. So people today enter into 15-year PPAs with the likes of Amazon, with utility companies, and so on. And so, go back to my model, where I told you there's a power plant which has a contract with Hydro-Quebec, one which has for 30 years and a toll agreement, the other one that is maybe 10 years, and the other one is nothing at all. Solar has to be in the first category because of the intermittency. You're not producing solar electricity all the time. So the use of your cost is for a small period of time when there is sun. So therefore, you have to have someone who's giving you a long-term contract. If it's not a utility, it's an Amazon, Microsoft, or any other company that effectively will give you. The returns on those kinds of solar are low, precisely because we have long-term, 8%, something like that.
So unfortunately, we are out of time, but Sadek, I really thank you for that. I think everyone can see that sort of the values, the creativity, the opportunity. You can build something very special. You've built obviously a very special firm, and I can't thank you enough for joining us. We do have a small gift for you that I will show you, and we have made a donation on your behalf to our wonderful causes for today. So I did want to give you that.
Is that me?
That would be you.
Yes.
That would be you golfing. But thank you so
I'm not
much.
a very good golfer.
Well, no. Well, thank you for joining us, and thank you all for joining us as well. So, yeah, excellent. Yeah. Thank you very much. That was great.